think what's hard about the book of Jeremiah is that when you look at the text, it doesn't seem to reflect the chronological sequence of his life. That's, in one word, what I believe makes the book very, very difficult. Generally, when you read a book, it goes through the history of one's life. That's not the book of Jeremiah. And what's really required is to know the history of his life, at least in general terms, and then to be able to pinpoint the different chapters in the book, and it could be a kind of puzzle, it's a quagmire, and to see what refers to what. For example, the first part of Jeremiah's life, we're told right in the beginning that he prophesies in the kingship of Yoshiyahu. And Yoshiyahu was one of the most important kings. As a matter of fact, in Sefer Melachim, he is described as the best of the kings. It's a great tragedy because it didn't take long after Yoshiyahu when that kingdom was destroyed. He was the last hope and he was the best of the hope. And he actually becomes king when he's 8 years old. Now what that means exactly is not clear. It could be that he wasn't really a king at 8, he was working with an elder statesman, but officially he becomes King. Yoshiyahu does it.
But his mother is the regent.
Yes, so it's quite possible that she has an influence over him. Now, in the 13th year of Yoshiyahu's rule, Jeremiah comes on the scene. So we know that. We know that Jeremiah comes on the scene in the 13th year. And we also know, because we're told in Sefer Melachim in the Book of Kings, that in the 18th year of Yoshiyahu rules for 31 years, in the 18th year, that's when they find this Torah scroll and the Reformation begins. Which means that Jeremiah is offering prophecy for 5 years before the Reformation, before the beginning of the Reformation. And that's very, very important. And so if I were to offer a first chapter on Jeremiah, I would say that his first prophecy deals with those 5 years. Now it's also important to recognize that those 5 years, the kingship of Jeremiah, comes off the worst of the kings. The most terrible of kings preceded Yoshiyahu. The most terrible was his grandfather, whose name is Menashe, and he actually rules for 55 years. He was the low of the low. He's followed by his son Ammon, who rules for 2 years. But during that period of time, there basically is no prophecy. Oh, you have false prophets, terrible prophets, who, if you will, feed into Menashe's rebellion against God and everything that's ethically that's ethically of meaning. But there's no kingship. There's no prophecy, so that when Jeremiah
killed Yeshayahu. I just learned that. Menashe killed Yeshayahu.
Menashe Yeshayahu.
Yes.
Yeah, Yeshayahu. But that's not Yoshiyahu. Yeshayahu is a prophet, Yoshiyahu is the king.
What are the names in English?
Yoshiyahu is Josiah, Josiah. So we have been, so far, we have dealt with 1/2 of Jeremiah's prophecy in his first 5 years. That is, again, from the 13th to the 18th year of Yoshiyahu. And that's the time period when he looks to the north. And what does he find in the north? He first of all finds that it's been exiled. The 10 tribes have been exiled. He also finds that it's leaderless. And his prophecy to the north is a prophecy of hope, of optimism, Yirmiyahu is encouraging the Jews of the north, primarily the Jews of the north, that what should they do? They should reunify with the kingdom of the south, which is still in existence. There's no kingdom of the north by the time Yirmiyahu is born.
So what is there?
There are remnants of Jews who remained in the north. The Assyrians had exiled the 10 tribes. When we talk about different tribes who've been found, or they allege that they are part of the 10 tribes, there are people who say Native Americans were from the 10 tribes. Goes on and on. B'nai Menashe in India. Everybody, the Mormons are the 10 tribes. Everybody's the 10 tribes. This goes back to the year 722 before the Common Era, when that exile took place. But there are Jews who are still remaining. And to those Jews, Jeremiah is offering, as I said, he is extremely optimistic, and he encourages them, unite with the kingdom of the south. That's one half of what he does during that 5-year period. But there's another piece, there's another half. And that is the half when he is speaking, when he, during this 5-year period, before the Reformation, he is speaking to the south. He's speaking to the kingdom of Judah. Now that is a kingdom which is still intact. The exile has not yet taken place. The temple is still intact. He's speaking to the kingdom of the south that has had very poor leaders. And at that point, even if Yoshiyahu, Josiah, was not a bad guy, he's not yet a good guy. And his message to the south is the flip opposite of his message to the north. To the north, he's optimistic, he's hopeful, return, he's encouraging. To the south, he's very, very strong. And he condemns and reprimands in the strongest terms the way the people of the south are conducting themselves. And whereas the first prophecy of reunification takes place primarily, as we have studied, in chapter 3 and chapter 31, those are the chapters which we've studied. We have the introductory chapter of Jeremiah, chapter 1, and then we have chapter 3. You see the way we're jumping around now. And then chapter 31, which talks about the reunification. It's chapter 2, which is the chapter which talks about the decay, the deterioration of the southern kingdom and Jeremiah's message to that southern kingdom. Now last week we studied very, very carefully about Rachel is crying for her children. For which children is Rachel crying? Well, Rachel is the mother of the northern kingdom, because Rachel is the mother of Joseph, whose primary son is Ephraim. That's why the kingdom of the north is called the kingdom of Ephraim. And when the children of the north are exiled in the year of 722, the Pshuto Shel Mikra, the literal meaning of the text, is they passed by Rachel's grave, and Rachel mivaka al baneha. Rachel is crying for her children. Me'ana lehinachem. She refuses to be comforted. And God, through Jeremiah, responds and says, Vishavu vanim lidvulam. The day will come when the north will return. Did Jeremiah see it in his lifetime? Frankly, no. But the prophecy, as we've been saying, is not only a prophecy for Jeremiah's lifetime, but it casts its light well into the future, and the hope is that one day, and maybe we're beginning to see it, that the tribes of the north will return. So when we say on Rosh Hashanah, Habein Yakir Li Ephraim, that Jeremiah in the name of God says, my precious child is Ephraim, it's from chapter 31. It's talking about God saying, I hear you, Mother Rachel, Ephraim will one day return. This hope, and what we've been stressing is that when you read the prophets, I think it's important to understand its message for contemporary times, the hope for reunification, and as I've said, from my perspective, the most challenging item on the Jewish agenda is not the physical defense of Israel, and Lord knows that we face all kinds of challenges. More people were stabbed in Jerusalem today. We've got to be strong, and Lord knows that we have a spiritual challenge to understand why we have a Jewish state. It's not enough to have an army to defend Jews. The army must understand, why should we be defending Jews? Why are we Jews? More important than all of that is we can't be a split people. And while it is true that from the right to the left, Jews on Israel disagree on 20% of the issues, we have to remember that on 80%, we do agree. 80% we agree. The 20% is from Meretz to Naftali Bennett. But there's 80% we agree upon, and we better learn to emphasize that 80%. And in the 20%, we better, in the words of Menachem Begin, learn to agree disagreeably. Stop impugning each other's motives and getting along. So this session is going to be dealing with the latter half of Jeremiah's prophecy during that 5-year period of Yoshiahu's reign, from the 13th to the 18th year, when he speaks about the decay of Judah. And so the key sentence here is, and I leave it to you to read all of chapter 2, is chapter 2, sentence 8. Chapter 2, sentence 8. Page 8. Here's what he says.
This one there.
HaKohanim, this is as a matter of fact, just before we read that, I want to read from the book of Zephaniah, which you do not have. Zephaniah was another prophet who ruled during this period of time. Here's what it says. First sentence of Zephaniah. I'm thinking actually of just taking this, and Mrs. Fine this, but I think we all need the JPS. It's a, not that this is a bad text, but I think the translation here is better. Dvar Adonai asher haya el Zephaniah ben Kushi ben Gedalia ben Amoria ben Hizkiah. This is the word of the Lord to Zephaniah, bimei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yudah. He prophesies during the time of Yoshiyahu. Just as, if you look at chapter 1, sentence 1 in Jeremiah, we're going to find that he too prophesies during this period of time. Sentence 2, Asher haya dvar Adonai elav bimei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yehuda. So Tzfanya is basically a colleague of Yirmiyahu. He's prophesying at the same time. And now I'm reading... I'm sorry?
Is Zephaniah in the north?
No, in the south. He's prophesying to Yoshiyahu. And in chapter 3, sentence 4, I'm reading from the book of Zephaniah. This is his description of what is happening. Nivieha pochazim. Nivieha pochazim. Sentence 4. Her prophets are reckless. Pachas kamayim. They move about aimlessly, quickly. Anshe bogdot. A boged is a faithless person. Faithless fellows. Kohaneha chilulu kodesh. Her priests profane what is holy. Chamsu Torah. They do violence to the Torah. The translation here, they give perverse rulings. That's Zephaniah chapter 3, sentence 4. His description of what's happening during the time of Yoshiyahu. Now let's look at our sentence. Sentence 8. Here's the description. HaKohanim lo amru aye Adonai. The priests did not say, where is the Lord? V'tosei HaTorah, those, it's on page 8, Rebbe, and those that handle the law, v'tosei HaTorah, tofes, those who grab the law, lo yida'uni, they do not know me. V'haroim poshuvi, literally, and the shepherds, the rulers, transgressed against me. V'hanvi'im nibe'u v'ba'al, and the prophets also prophesied by Baal. Va'acharei lo yo'ilu halachu, and they walk after things that do not profit. I want to take a look at the JPS translation. I'll read the JPS if you can follow me in your translation here from the Cincino. Here's what the JPS translation reads of chapter 2, sentence 8. Here it is. The priest never asked themselves, where is the Lord? Okay, pretty close. Then it continues. The guardians of the teachings ignored me. I like that translation better. The rulers rebelled against me, or the shepherds rebelled against me. And the prophets prophesied by Baal and followed what can do no good. Now I'd like to take this phrase by phrase so that we get a sense of what Jeremiah is talking about. HaKohanim lo amru ayeh Adonai. The priests did not ask, where is the Lord? This is now the beginning of sentence 8. So let me put this out as a question. Isn't that an oxymoron? The priests are people of God. How is it possible, when you read this, that the priests do not ask, where is the Lord?
It's an inherent position.
That's foundational to the mission of the priests. So what is he describing here?
Despair.
Despair.
They had no faith.
And yet they're priests.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And yet they have no faith.
Because
Yes.
they're sons of priests. I mean, it's an inherited position, right?
And
Is your
therefore,
father a Kohen?
right. And therefore, what are you saying? They may not be worthy.
But they didn't follow the rules.
Uh-huh.
Could it not just be that they were
They
just
weren't
taking it for
taught
granted?
properly.
Sorry, Dan?
Could it not just be that they were just taking it for granted? Not that they didn't believe or did believe or didn't believe, but just,
They took it for granted.
you know, it's just doing it by rote.
Milton?
If you read the text literally, then, and they didn't ask where's God, one could then say they didn't have to ask where God is, because if you take it literally, they knew where God was because of Kohanim, so they didn't ask where's God. But if you take it in terms of not literally, then they could have been, they abandoned God, or they could have said, you know what, it's not worthwhile. We have a lot of problems in the northern kingdom and different difficulties. We're not even going to ask where God is because he doesn't exist. So it's very different than taking it literally. Because if somebody asked someone devout, why didn't you ask where God was? Why should he ask? He or she asked. They believe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Okay.
No, it's very good. It's a very good point. Howard?
It's so similar to Samuel, I think chapter 2, with Hophni and Phinehas, and they didn't walk in the way of Hashem as the
They
priests,
were children of priests. They were priests themselves.
and bad things befell that generation that they saw. So it was a telling of things to happen, and I think it was chapter 2.
And what it is chapter 2 right there, chapter 2, chapter 3. Howard, you're becoming a great expert. It's great. What's the role of the priest?
Sacrifices, to do the
Sacrifices.
Was he supposed to be the intermediary between the people and God, supposedly?
Sacrifices, intermediaries. Anyone else? What is the role of the priest?
The explanation down here says.
What is it?
To teach.
To teach.
The duty is to teach.
To teach.
I thought that was the job of the ladies.
The ladies used to sing songs. but it's their job too, it's their job too. But the Kohanim are primarily teachers.
No.
The Bible,
Throughout
for
history, they've
the
been
Bible,
bad.
the Bible, for
It's not
example,
true.
the Bible, for
Yes, it is
example,
true.
says
I
in
mean,
the
not
preamble
now.
to the giving of the Torah, "Vatem tiuli mamlechet kohanim," that the Jewish people is to be a kingdom of priests. What in the world does that mean? What does it mean that we're supposed to be a kingdom of priests? We're supposed to be teachers. We're supposed to be teachers of what, Saul? Spreading the message of ethical monotheism.
Right.
I'm quick to say that doesn't mean that other people, other races, and Israel is thank God race blind. If it weren't race blind, they couldn't be Jewish. But it doesn't mean that there are no other nationalities, no other faiths that don't have a message to teach. Of course they do. But it means we have something very, very unique to teach. Vatem tiuli mamlechet kohanim, vatem tiuli mamlechet kohanim, in chapter 19, Perek Yutet of Shemot, means you'll be a kingdom of priests and you'll be the teachers of the world. To spread ethical monotheism. The word Kiddush Hashem means to sanctify God's name. Martin Buber says it means, Kiddush Hashem means to bring God and God's system. He says it's to bring God into the world. I'm embellishing on Buber, if I may, and say that it means to bring God's message of ethical monotheism into the world. Chilul Hashem, the word chilul, halal, means hollow. It's to hollow out the world from God. It means to diminish God and the system of ethics from the world. Example, from my perspective, the greatest chilul Hashem, the greatest desecration of God's name ever in history that a Jew perpetrated was the assassination of the Prime Minister of Israel. In front of 1 billion, 2 billion people, for somebody to say, God commanded me to assassinate the Prime Minister. Now we're discerning enough to understand that that's not nonsense, but there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who saw that as being real. That is the pushing away of God from this world.
They gave him a wife in prison. He had
So
a
the
child
role,
in prison.
good. So the role of the priest is to teach. Now, where does the priest teach? Where? But
So
something.
they limit him.
But something was happening here. Something was happening. It's soon going to happen in a dramatic way. In just a few years after Yoshiyahu, the temple is going to be destroyed. And the center of Judaism is no longer going to be in the temple. Where will the center be? We will no longer be temple centered. And this is a very critical point. We're going to be
Synagogue.
synagogue,
Tefillah.
Torah, learning centered. Look, the destruction of the temple was a terrible, terrible thing, and we long for the time for it to be rebuilt. Traditional Jews like myself, are always talking about Yibaneh Bet HaMikdash, may the temple be rebuilt. But like everything in life, everything that has a negative has a little bit of a sliver of a positive. Just look at the moon tonight. You can see the beautiful sliver of the new moon. It's absolutely gorgeous. And the positive that emerged from that is that we were no longer centralized. And so there were Torah centers that developed all over the world. Now at this time, in the time of Yoshiyahu, my sense is we were already moving in that direction. After all, where does Yirmiyahu come from? He comes from Anatot. He's not in Jerusalem. He comes from Anatot. He's outside of Jerusalem. And so what does the text say here? The text says, HaKohanim, the priests who are supposed to be teachers, bringing the message of God and the message of ethical monotheism throughout Israel. They were not asking the question, Ayeh Adonai. I want to say something about this. You can be in synagogue for an hour, 2 hours, and 3 hours, and not once feel the presence of God. You could say the name God and may not feel God. So what this is saying is that Jeremiah is portraying a scene where the priests were missing what their responsibilities were all about. Their responsibility was to bring the message of Judaism throughout the land. But that's not what the priests were doing. the Kohanim were asking, where is the Lord? They had lost, if you will, their direction. Their compass was pointed in a place where it should not be pointed. Let me stop here, get your reflections and get your thoughts on this. Yes.
I just have one question. If the Kohanim, or if Judaism was, everybody was supposed to be teachers for everybody else, why were there so few Kohanim? Why were they just a select few, and then not even through education, just by inheritance?
Look, it's a great question, and the truth of the matter is, the system that preceded the Kohanim had a lot to be said about it. Who were the priests before the priests became the priests? Who were the priests? Because when did the priest become the priest? At one moment, at what point in history, in the Bible, when does that occur? Anybody remember?
Is it in the desert?
It's in the
Aaron.
desert. You can't go wrong with that 11.
At Sinai?
You're absolutely right.
It's right.
It's what happens after you see it. Who were the priests when we left Egypt?
Aaron?
No.
Who were the priests? The priest was the eldest in each family. It's an interesting program. The eldest of each family, look, it's patriarchal, the eldest son. So that's not where I want to go, and you know what I feel about women's role. I don't feel like to defend myself, but that's the way it was. The eldest son. So it was, in each family there was a representative. That's a pretty good system. In every family there's going to be someone who's going to be dedicated to education, responsible to educating the family. But what happens? We receive the Torah, and soon after we receive the Torah,
There you go.
the golden calf. And who participates in the golden calf? Everyone does. The eldest does as well. And it's then that the shift takes place. Because it's the tribe of the Levites, and the Kohanim are part of the Levites, they don't participate. So the movement of being the teacher is a movement from the representative of each family to the Kohanim. But ultimately, the role of the Kohen was to get out there and to teach the message of Torah, of ethical monotheism, to all of Israel. And so, Jeremiah says, HaKohanim lo amru ayeh Adonai. The priests did not ask the question, where is the Lord? They didn't even ask the question. You know, it's one thing to say, I don't know where the Lord is, but at least keep searching. It's okay. It's okay if you don't find God. But it gets a little dangerous when you're not looking, when you're not searching, when you're not asking the questions. You know, in Yiddish they have an expression, "Von Akasha ken men nicht sterben." Nobody has died from a question. You know when people die? You know when rabbis die? When I'm getting no questions, I'm in trouble. And the Kohanim were not asking the question. V'tovsei HaTorah. Now he moves to a second piece. V'tovsei HaTorah, and the handlers of the Torah. Let's see again the way the JPS translates it. And the guardians of the teaching. The guardians of the teaching. Rashi actually understands this as being the judges. And they that handle the law knew me not. Anybody want to take a stab at that? What's the deeper message that the handlers of the law, the judges, knew me not? Yes, Milton?
They knew Torah. They knew the rote of practicing, but they really didn't know Hashem. In other words, they really, in their depth, they went through motions, which also, of course, in my view, has ramifications for today. People who, unlike our community, where we immerse ourselves, the people who just do things by rote, but the value system really doesn't know Yiddu'uni means not Yodu, not that it doesn't say that they didn't know, they knew, but Yiddu'uni means that they didn't know God. He's talking about himself.
Right.
So the deeper question is the value system.
In other words, and at least the rabbi of this community has a long way to go. So a long way to go to make it, to pass the bar. the community is much better than I am. I have a long way to go. But I think you're saying something very interesting. What Milton is saying is, yeah, that the judges may have gone through the law in a perfunctory, external way, but they never internalized it. Let's take a look at Jeremiah for a moment, chapter 22, sentence 16. 22, sentence 16.
What page? 148. What?
Here we have a presentation of what a judge should be, what a judge should be doing. It's on page 147. Chapter 22, sentence 16. Let's see what it says here. Dan din ani ve'evyon. Translation, here in the JPS, he upheld the rights of the poor and needy. Oz tov, then it is well. The judge should be judging the cause of the poor and needy, then it is well. Halo hi hada'at oti. That's truly healing me. Nu'um Adonai, says the Lord. That's what judgment is all about. So one could argue that what's happening here is actually the reverse of that. It was a judge who went perfunctorily through the chapter and verse of the law, but never internalized it. Or I'll take it a step further. Maybe it's a judge who internalized it, but it remained cerebral, it remained intellectual. He didn't act upon that responsibility. If somebody were to ask me, what is the mission of Judaism? The mission is, and you've heard this from me before, is I believe in Genesis, in Reshit, Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Yutet, where God is about ready to destroy the people of Sodom. And he says, before I do so, I must tell Abraham about this, because after all, Abraham is the first patriarch, he's the father of the covenant. And this is what God says about what he has mandated to Abraham. Ki yidativ, because I love Abraham. Leman asher yitzaveh et banav et beito acharav, because Abraham is going to command his lineage into the future. Here it is. This is the mission. Vishamru derech Adonai. To God, to protect, to observe the way of the Lord. And here comes the three words we should all memorize. La'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. To do righteousness and justice. For me, that's the mission. For me, every page of the Talmud, every piece of the code of law, I have to try to understand how it fits into this mission of la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. But underline the word la'asot. What does la'asot mean? La'asot
To
means
do.
Be busy with,
To do.
to be, yeah.
to be busy. It means that you need some action. It's not the first step, Milton, is as you said. That there were those judges who externally went through the motions, but internally they were far, far from being on course. And there were those who internalized the message. Maybe it was in their head, maybe it was in their heart, but they didn't translate that into action. Now let's look at this text. The Tosei HaTorah, and those who handled the law, knew me not. The message is, that Jeremiah says, is that the religious act cannot be confined to meditative thought, but it has to reach the point of active caring, being there for the most vulnerable. And he looks at society and he sees that that's missing. He sees the priests who are no longer the teachers. They don't even ask, where is the Lord? And then he sees the judges, the ones who are supposed to make the law. Even if they internalize it, they don't act upon the law. Lo yida'uni, they do not know me. They do not act accordingly. They do not act like they know me. Yes, Charles?
I have two questions, actually. One has to do with King Josiah, who was supposed to be a good king. And if he was a good king, then knowing God is not as significant as doing good to your fellow man. So that confuses me, that he's criticizing the priests, but the king is a good king and at a good time, and I'm confused by
When
which
he
is
becomes,
right.
at this point, we are not yet at the 18th year when he begins the Reformation. There's something probably instinctively good about Yoshiyahu, but the formal program of Reformation has not yet started.
What is the Reformation?
The Reformation is, it had been, the Southern Kingdom had been a kingdom that had forsaken God, had forsaken God's principles of living an ethical and a good life. And Jeremiah is going to talk a little bit about ritual, especially about Shabbat pretty soon. None of that was there.
This is
And
the southern-
Jeremiah is talking about this decay,
This is the
this
southern kingdom
deterioration.
that he's talking about? This is the southern kingdom?
The
that
Southern
he's talking
Kingdom.
about? I'm sorry. I thought I said-
He's talking now about the Southern Kingdom. To the Northern Kingdom, he's very optimistic, as we've pointed out. They're leaderless, they have no sovereignty, he's encouraging them to reunify. To the Southern Kingdom, he's much tougher. Now, I thought, you actually touched upon something very powerful, because one wonders, what is it that inspired Yoshiyahu to send somebody out to find and to clean the temple where they found the Torah, and this process of rejuvenation starts? You wonder, did the prophet, did Yirmiyahu, did he inspire it? Or did Yoshiyahu do it on his own? That's a subject of serious discussion, and I'm
I
not sure
have
anybody has
one
the
other
answer to
question.
that.
And you said that the Northern Kingdom at this point was dispersed. There was no kingdom. There were just a few people living in
They
it.
were exiled in 722, years before.
And Jeremiah said, in effect, combined with the Southern Kingdom.
He told the people, the Jews of the north, who were still there, even though they were living under Assyrian rule, he said to them, come back to the south.
Does that mean physically go to the South? Or does it mean form a new nation of your own and combine with the South?
My read is come back to the south.
Physically pick up, sell your house?
Physically, come
Come to
back
the
to the south. Maybe one day the dream is that
So you-
we would once again be in the north as well, but at this point, come back to the south. But what I wanted to leave with you today, the message is that Jeremiah is speaking to a society that is corrupt. The priests were corrupt, the judges were corrupt, and he continues on, V'haroim pashuvi, and the shepherds transgressed against me. Haroim, the shepherds, actually, that's a euphemism. The Roim, the shepherds, are the leaders. The leaders have transgressed against me. It's a metaphor for the leaders.
Why? I'm
Which
sorry, I
page
don't
is
see
he
shepherds
reading,
as
Connie?
leaders.
Well,
What is he
that
reading now?
term is
Two?
often
Page
the
nine.
shepherd, the leaders of the Jewish
Very
people.
top of page nine.
are
I
still
know, originally they were, it said.
right. So
shepherd.
it's that concept. The imagery of the shepherd is when you're a shepherd and you have a flock. If there's one sheep that's missing, you really feel it very, very deeply. So the metaphor for Jewish leadership is the caretaker, is the shepherd. Frankly, you know who's taking this over,
Jesus.
right? The Pope himself, his private plane. What is it called? I think it's called Shepherd One, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't that what it's called? Okay, it's from the text here. Veroim, and the shepherd, the shepherds pashuvi, and so we have the priests have gone astray, the judges have gone wrong, The shepherds have transgressed. V'hanevi'im nibu'u v'bal. And the prophets have prophesied. They've prophesied against the Baal. Now remember, I said this to you before, this is coming off the era of Menashe and the era of Ammon, where the prophets, if they were prophets, they were false prophets. You know, everyone is talking now about whether Obama, and I don't want to get into the politics, whether he stepped beyond his power, and basically there's a system of checks and balances, and those who oppose what he said about immigration, and everybody here, I'm sure has a different opinion, which we're not looking for at this point. So I'll try to hold back, we'll all try to hold back. But, you know, the discussion is Congress makes law, was he making a law, and then somebody says in a Talmudic way he wasn't making law, this and that and that. Well, guess where checks and balances come from? It basically comes from the Jewish system. And in the Jewish system, there was a king. And the king was basically the executive leader. He had executive power. He was like the president. Now, he's not the president, but basically he is that singular person who's leading the people. Who was his checks and balance, by the way? His primary checks and balance?
The prophet.
The prophet. The prophet was always the one who spoke truth to power. That's where the expression comes from. Truth to power. Although I'd like to think that actually truth is power. And it's more powerful than power. But he's supposed to speak truth to power. Well, if you're truth to power, you can't be a yes man or a yes woman, if I may add. And there were women who were prophets. It's not so simple when, you know, you're sitting in the Oval Office and the president is asking for your input, and people become yes people. There are very, very few people have the gumption and the backbone in the face of the power to say, you know something, I think you're wrong. That is what the prophet was all about. The prophet, when you think of the imagery of the king and the way he was dressed in regal, kingly rulership clothes, and compared to the prophet walked around without shoes, the prophet with a little makil. He's mamish wearing shmatas. And in the shmata, it's like Natan HaNavi turning to King David, and in a sweet way, he tells him his parable when he had inappropriate relations with Bathsheba and saw to it that her husband was murdered. He goes through this parable, and then he turns to David and he says, "You're the guy, Ata Ha'ish." Let me tell you, it takes a very unusual person to say, "You're the person."
So
It takes a lot of strength to be able to say that. I'm not saying that there weren't prophets in the time of Menashe, the most evil. There were prophets, but they were false prophets. And instead of being a check and a balance against the king, they abetted the wickedness of Menashe. This is the first time in 100 years where there will be a prophet like Yirmiyahu who's going to stick it to the king, frankly, and is going to say it the way he's going to say it. But Jeremiah, in the beginning of his prophecy, looks out there and he says, "V'nevi'im nibu'u babal." And the Nevi'im, instead of being a moral check, they reinforce immorality. There's a beautiful sentence here. If you take a look at chapter 2, sentence 18. Let's take a look at this. He's talking about how the people had left the way of God. Let's take a look at sentence 18. Do you want to take it still into English? And now,
what hast thou to do in the way to Egypt, to drink the waters of Shihor? Or what hast thou to do in the way to Assyria, to drink the waters of the river?
okay, I guess the Shihor is a major river. So what is he saying? Vatam malach liderech Mitzrayim. What is he saying here? I mean, I know for many of us this is new. The language is new. The jargon is new. This is not narrative. We've always started narrative. He speaks in a poetic formula. And now he's saying to the people, Malach liderech Mitzrayim, Jeremiah says. What is it that you're moving towards Egypt? And what does Egypt represent in the Bible? Egypt is, that's the language I use. Egypt is the anti-covenant. I'm not talking about Egypt today. Egypt in the Bible is the anti-covenant. So God says to Abraham, go to Canaan. Guess what happens? He goes too far south. He winds up in Egypt. And that is the clash between the covenant and the anti-covenant. And I get the chills when I tell you this. What's the whole Bible about? Historically, the whole Bible is about, it's the covenant. And the covenant, the whole Bible is about leaving Egypt. Yetziat Mitzrayim. Leaving Egypt. And Jeremiah says, are you going mad? How come you're going back to Egypt? Vata malach liderech Mitzrayim. I should get really, the malach is it's a beautiful expression. Let's see if I can find it quickly. It's
Were there
Jeremiah.
people from Yehuda that were actually returning to Mitzrayim?
I'm sorry?
I wasn't aware there were people from Yehuda that were going to
No,
Mitzrayim.
what he's saying is,
Figuratively.
he's saying it,
Figuratively.
he's saying figuratively, why
Oh,
you
you're
returning.
reading the Torah and...
By the way, by the time we get to the end of the book of Kings 2, it's fascinating, but after Gedaliah ben Achikam, the governor appointed by Rome, after he is assassinated, there's a text that's not well known, but at the end of Kings 2, the last sentence, you know what it says? And the remnants of the Jewish people, do you know where they were taken? They were taken to Egypt. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. First, let's take this one at a time. What sentence am I reading now? I'm reading
18.
chapter 2, sentence 18. Okay, so let's see the JPS translation. Here, the JPS translation is the following. It is, what then is the good of your going to Egypt? That's the way they translate Malach. To drink of the waters of the Nile. That's Shichor. What's the value in that? Why are you doing that? So let me just look at the last sentence of Malachim Bet. We're picking it up right after this Jewish governor had been assassinated. What does it say? It says, it's not the last sentence, but it's in chapter 25, sentence 25. It says here, and in the 7th year, this Yishmael comes. It's interesting, Yishmael. It's complicated, but Yishmael's mother was who? Was Hagar. And Hagar actually was an Egyptian woman who Abraham receives from Pharaoh when he had gone south to Egypt. I ran through that. And it says that he's now assassinated. And then it says, Vayakumu chola ami koton ba'ad godo v'soreya chayalim vayovo'u Mitzrayim. It's unbelievable. Where do they go? They go to Egypt. The whole Torah is about leaving Egypt. And how does it end up? Literally here it's going back to Egypt. Here he's talking figuratively. Why are you going back to Egypt? And not only that, he adds, what does he add to in sentence 18? He also says, Uma lach l'derech Ashur. And why are you going figuratively back to Assyria? Where's Assyria? North where? Northeast. Aram is closest, then Assyria. It's Iraq.
The Euphrates.
The Euphrates. Lishtot mei nahar, to drink of the Euphrates. And to the careful reader of the Bible, oh my God, what's going on here? Because after all, where do the seeds, where do our first patriarchs and matriarchs come from? Where do we come from?
From there.
We come from there. All of the Torah is about coming from there, and Jeremiah looks out and says, hey, what are you going back there? That's where we're coming from. The Bible is about coming from the northeast into Israel. That's the biblical language. Abraham comes from the other side of the river. And we're supposed to leave Egypt. And Jeremiah looks out, and what does he see? He sees that the prophets are false prophets, and they're figuratively, where are they leading the people? They're leading the people back
To slavery.
The evil ways.
back to where we had come from. We're about leaving Egypt, not returning to Egypt. We're about coming from Assyria, not returning to Assyria. And that's the description of what's occurring in this period of time. Let's take now a look at it. We just did one sentence. Could you imagine going through this sentence by sentence? But it's a powerful sentence. Vatam Malach L'derech Mitzrayim. I'm sorry, chapter 2, let's go to sentence 8. I'm sorry. HaKohanim lo amru ayeh Adonai. The priest did not say, where is the Lord? V'tosei HaTorah lo yida'uni. And the judges don't even know me. V'haro'im pashuvi. And the leaders have transgressed against me. V'nevi'im nibu ba'al. They prophesy in the Baal rather than speaking truth to power. They prophesy with the Baal. V'acharei lo yo'ilu halachu, and they walk after things that have no purpose. It kind of comes together if you take a look for a moment at chapter 9, sentence 22 and 23. Because the truth of the matter is, and this is classic Jeremiah, these are two of the most important sentences in all of the book of Jeremiah. Basically, what Jeremiah is saying, look, you have priests, you have judges, you have leaders, you have prophets, but they're empty. They've all gone astray. And look at what he says in these sentences. Let's take a look at it. Chapter 9, sentence 22 and 23, page 72. Ko amar Adonai, thus says the Lord, very famous. Al yitalel chacham b'chachmato. Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. The al yitalel hagibor b'gvurato. Neither let the mighty person glory in his might. Al yitalel ashir ba'ashro. Let not the rich person glory in his riches. Ki im bezot yitalel hamitalel. But let him that glories glory in this. Haskel b'yodoa oti. The one who understands and really knows me. Ki ani Adonai, for I am the Lord, Oseh chesed, who does kindness, mishpat, justice, tzedakah, and righteousness ba'aretz, in the land. Ki ba'ele chafatzti. So beautiful. This is what I desire. Adonai, says the Lord. What God is saying here is, I'm not interested in the external stuff. I'm not interested in the outer shell. I'm interested in the inner stuff. And the prophet Jeremiah, we're going to see soon next week how he talks about how he encourages the return, not only to an ethical path, but he talks about a return to the ritual, and the ritual which he talks about most, believe it or not, is the Sabbath, because of what the Sabbath represents. But what he's saying here is, I am the Lord who does kindness and justice and righteousness. This is what I desire. In other words, what's the mandate? We're supposed to emulate God. This is basically what I call a reverberating hope. And some of my favorite lines in the Psalms, and we say it in the prayer. It's in Psalm 146. We say it every morning, and it's must reading. It's one of my favorite. This is what the psalmist says. 146. He says about God, Oseh mishpat la'ashukim. Sentence 7. God does justice for the oppressed. Notein lechem l'ro'evim. He gives bread to the hungry. Adonai matir asirim. The Lord sets prisoners free. Adonai pokeach ivrim. The Lord restores sight to the blind. Adonai zokev kfufim. The Lord makes those who are bent stand straight. Adonai ohed tzadikim. Adonai shomeret gerim. The Lord protects the stranger. Yatom b'manaya udei. God supports the orphan and the widow. V'derech risha'im ya'avet. And he makes the path of the wicked tortuous. This is what I call the reverberating prayers. We speak about God as doing these wonderful things. What's the message? God says, and what are you doing to help me? What are you doing to help me in this effort? And this is not the society that Jeremiah sees. I do want to mention that I saw this laid out much more beautifully than I presented in a work by Rabbi Bini Lau, who was a rabbi in Israel, who really understands the sentence that we've studied in the way that we've presented it. And what's right about what I said is what he's touched upon. That's wrong, my embellishments, that's my fault. But it's a powerful, powerful, powerful message. Your thoughts, your reflections?
God isn't doing all these things.
I'm sorry.
God isn't doing these things, but it's sort of like a give and take. You know, I always talk about this wonderful little give and take between two people that I open up my book on holistic prayer, where one person says to the other person, sometimes I feel like asking God, why is there so much poverty and sickness and homelessness in the world? And so the second person says to the first person, well, why don't you ask God that question? And the first person says, because I'm afraid God's going to ask me the same question. So covenant means it goes in two ways. It's a two-way relationship, and as we speak about that God really desires tzedakah u'mishpat, God is asking us the same question. That, without getting into the politics, is what makes this whole immigration thing very complicated. It's not so simple. There's checks and balances, but that's what makes even, I'm not getting to politics now, but you know, if we're living in a country where there are millions of people who, you know, don't have a right to medical treatment, this is heavy stuff. The prophet would have a lot to say about this. This
Our
is what,
fathers were immigrants.
this is.
But they were legal.
Oh, that's not where I'm going. This is. Oh, I'm saying that this is. Yes.
Oh, I was just wondering about this contrast here that we have here between Jeremiah saying that what I require of you is that you do these things, and yet a lot of the language has to do with places, the north, the south, or the path going from here to there. And in fact, as you know, Hamakom is the place par excellence. It's another word for God. And so I'm wondering about this connection between spatiality.
Right. My take of that. My take, Michael, right? My take of that is that the prophet is speaking to the people, and when you speak to the hamonam, to the multitudes, you have to speak in a language that people understand. There's the speech that I give, and then there's the speech that people hear. If people hear something different than I meant, I'm to blame. The speech that counts most is what people hear. And I think the language of Assyria, the language of Egypt, was a language which resonated in the whole history of, in the Maisalach, in the stories that were handed down of the Jewish people. That's why I think he uses that language. He knows, I believe, that the people understood that it's all about leaving Egypt. And he says to them, guess what? You're returning to the ways of Egypt. He knows the people know where Abraham and Sarah come from. And says, well, why are you going back to that? A lot of Jeremiah is understanding the history and the politics of the relationship between Israel and Assyria and Babylonia, because there was a great conflict between Assyria and Babylonia, and also Egypt. And we'll talk about this because Egypt actually was very, very concerned about the Babylonian introducing an empire that would overtake Egypt. That's why it was in Egypt's interest to support Assyria. And it gets quite complicated, yes.
So what you said just now about getting the people to understand,
Yes.
what I'm seeing is he's saying that Judah is rotten from top to bottom,
That's what he's saying.
but maybe you don't even realize
Yeah.
how rotten you are.
Right,
And I'm slapping you in the face
right.
to get you to see how you've lost your way.
Isn't that-
You think you're obeying the
Sounds
law,
great.
you think you're doing the right thing, but you're not.
Isn't that the way of life? That sometimes
Isn't that being too generalized? I mean, after all, even, was it, at Sodom and Gomorrah, he tried to look for some decent people. Wouldn't Jeremiah want to look for some decent people and not generally categorize all of Judea?
Sounds like he did.
But
Well-
what Saul is saying is, and I think in life one can get so just immersed in the quicksand of negative stuff, you don't even know you're in the quicksand. And maybe you require that slap to be kind of to snap to attention. And I'd add just one more thing, and that is that, and this will be the last point I want to make, and then I'll take Milton, you'll have the last word, and that is that it's fascinating that this is happening on the heels, Labriut, on the heels of the exile of the 10 tribes. Because what he's really saying to the southern kingdom, didn't you learn your lesson? It's not as if you don't know what happened to the northern kingdom. Notwithstanding that what happened to the northern kingdom, this is what you keep doing. So again, we've actually studied this. If you look at chapter 3, it touches upon this. Chapter 3, sentence 1, and chapter 3, sentence 8. You know what? Let's just take sentence 8. For a red, what chapter 3, sentence 8, what page do we have it here? I'm in
20.
20. Okay, let's take it from this and see now. For a red, and I saw. Ki akol odot asher niafa meshuva Yisrael shilachtiha. Vo'ereh, ki al kolodot, when asher na'afa. Na'afa comes from the word ni'uf. What does ni'uf mean? Adultery. When I saw all of your adulterous activities, when I saw all of this, right? Meshuva Yisrael, and shilachtiha, and I cast the northern kingdom aside because they had forsaken me. They had not been faithful to me. Va'etain et sefer kirituteha eleha. Sefer Kritut is really a get. And I divorced the northern tribe. And then he says, V'lo yar'ah, and you, Judah, saw all of this, and you were not afraid? Bogeda Yehuda Achuta, you, Yehuda, the sister of the north, continue to act contentably? Vatelech vatizen gamhi, and you in the south go out and continue acting as a harlot? Let me take a look at this in the JPS, chapter 3, sentence 8. Here's the translation. I noted, because rebel Israel had committed adultery, I cast her off and handed her a bill of divorce. Yet her sister, faithless Judah, was not afraid. She too went and whored. It's very powerful. You didn't learn your lesson. It's actually the words in the Hebrew is really, it's powerful. For Eren, I saw ki akolodot. I saw all of ki akolodot Hashem yafa mishuva Yisrael, the backsliding Israel with all of its, because of all of its adulterous behavior. Shilachtiha, I sent her out, and I gave her a get. And then, V'lo yar'ah, Boda Yehuda Achuta, and you, Judah, you didn't learn your lesson? Vatelech vatizen gamhi, and you continue to act immorally. Here, Jeremiah is saying that all of this that you've done on top of the northern kingdom being exiled. You still didn't learn your lesson. It's really, Milton?
I just want to know if we know, based on his nevuah, if that the Kohanim, did they ever try to silence him, or did they ever try to?
Oh, yeah.
They did try to silence him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I just felt over. Yeah.
He did not have an easy life.
They did not easily arrest. Yeah. And they didn't try to stop their
They
corruption.
arrested him
right?
for treason.
And what he does now, what Jeremiah does in this period of time is he calls for reform.
Mm-hmm.
And the chapters where he calls for reform is in chapter 10, where he calls for an abdication, stepping back from idolatry. And most interestingly, in chapter 17, which is really a powerful message about keeping the Sabbath. And he means the Sabbath not just externally, he means the internal message of the Sabbath as well. But this will be for the next time, but there's much to be said. But again, this is this first era of Jeremiah, from the 13th to the 18th year of Yoshiyahu, and we're going to have to see what happens once the Reformation begins, what happens to Jeremiah's prophecy. Yes?
This seems so contradictory to me. If he speaks to the north and tells them to come down to the south, and then he turns around and he tells the south how corrupt it is, why should they come down?
The best I can do with that element is that he has an agenda, his hope is.
I mean, unless he thinks that the north is going to help reform the
That's it, I
south.
didn't think of that, but that's interesting. That's very interesting. Or he thinks that this harsh language to the south will change the south. And the south, once Yoshiyahu begins the movement of return, the south does undergo a return. But Jeremiah is a perfectionist, and he says, I appreciate that you're doing better, but it's not good enough. And Jeremiah is going to argue in his second phase of his life, he's going to say that too much of your return is external and not internal. The Navi is the Navi who always is concerned about what's happening internally. Observance is important to the Navi, but only if the observance is complemented by something that's happening internally. So Isaiah the prophet, for example, says, why do I need your sacrifices? Your sacrifices are empty. And that's the message of the prophet. The message of the prophet is always calling that there be inner meaning to whatever external observance.
Shmuel says the same
involved in.
thing.
Shmuel says absolutely. Tov.
Hachefetz l'Adonai ba'olot
Very
u'zvachim
good. You really
l'shmoa b'kol Adonai.
beautiful. Beautiful.
And that's what we read every Rosh Chodesh.
And Amos too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Amos.
Excellent.
You know, throughout the whole Bible, we're being told how terrible
Right.
we are.
That's the Rosh Chodesh household.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
You're saying something very, very.
Didn't hear that.
I don't want to end on that.
And
That's,
when I
that's
read
What'd she
Eicha,
say?
I find it disgusting.
yeah, but that resonates with me because I think the ultimate goal of the prophet is to try to encourage people to return. And when you tell people, you tell your children, you're no good, you're no good, you're no good, you get to the point where you really come to believe.
Children don't want to
that
listen to
you're no
you,
good.
right?
Well,
But
no, they
there-
believe they're no good.
What?
They believe they're no good.
Yes, they don't
But
know.
there is another piece in the prophet, and the other piece is that God says, you are good, and I'm there for you. We've not seen it yet, but it's in the book of Yirmiyahu, it's in the book of Yeshayahu, and I guess it's a delicate balance.
Forgiveness is always there.
Yeah, I mean, look at the fact that God says, even though normally when you divorce you can't return and marry the same person if you've gone elsewhere, God says, I take you back. When Heschel wrote a book, and his book is God in Search of Man. You think about that.
That's Heschel.
God, when Heschel wrote God in Search of Man, what do you mean God in search of man? I thought we were supposed to be in search of God. But the love relationship is so deep that God is in search of us. Actually, that's not Heschel. That's the Bible. The first question in the Bible that God asks after Adam and Eve eat from the tree is what? What
Where
question?
are you? Where are you?
Ayeka,
Yeah.
where are you? I love that question. I love the question, more than a question, what I love about it, Saul, is that God is asking that question. Because when a parent stops asking, where are you, the relationship is over.
Do you know where your
Over.
children are?
It's over. But if God keeps saying, where are you, what does that mean? Only a God who cares. Only a God who loves says, where are you? That too is a very, very important message of the prophet. So now, next week, I'm doing something I've not done